All right, we'll get started. Thank you for joining this session on smart tech network infrastructure, something that typically gets thought about a little bit too late in the design, build, and process overall. So something that we're happy to get to talk about today, hopefully raise awareness for. But I've heard a lot of great content in the Smart Building Conference so far, really around smart building solutions, AI, which was a really interesting one, focus on sustainability and just where that's going. And I think the opportunity to make all this happen, it's kind of like, yeah, we want to go do all this cool stuff. How do we actually go do it? And so we're going to get into some questions around that, the practical side, if you will, of network infrastructure, and really focus on how do we bring all that infrastructure together, and then the cybersecurity aspect. So we'll get started. I'm Josh Kales. I'm the president of ATS. I've been there about 2 years. Before that, I was running 2 building automation businesses, Allerton and Phoenix Controls. And I like this network piece because I remember thinking, how do I get Allerton and Phoenix Controls to talk well to each other and make great lab solutions, life sciences solutions? And it was a lot harder than people expected. But we were able to get through it and make that happen today. Before I did that, I was in Asia for 10 years doing big project infrastructure across the region. So that's my background. I want to give our panelists a chance to introduce themselves, and we'll start with Saloni.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Saloni Habibuddin. I'm the Vice President of Development at Urban Visions. I'd like to begin by thanking the Smart Building Center for inviting Urban Visions and myself to this panel. I also want to make sure I thank McKinstry, specifically Rick Cochran and Mike Kowalik, our network architects. A lot of what we're going to share with you today is something that we created with them, and they did for us. Insight into Urban Visions, we are a privately held development company led by Greg Smith. We develop and we hold long-term and operate our buildings. So we are currently developing our next generation buildings, about 2 million square feet spread over 4 projects. 1 just started construction and 2 are teed up for next year. A little insight into me, I'm originally an architect who moved into development. Having overseen several buildings from inception through occupancy and post-occupancy, you know, I live with what I've overseen and what I've built with our team. And this really has shaped my philosophy as a development strategist to look at new development, new projects every time with let's begin with the end in mind and let's stay focused on the outcome.
Thank you, Saloni. Lauren.
Hi, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Lauren Yachman. I am the business unit manager for both audiovisual integration and low voltage construction here at McKinstry. I also just really want to thank the Smart Building Center for inviting me and for inviting McKinstry, Urban Visions, and ATS to participate in this panel today. I'm really humbly honored to be included in this illustrious group. I'm really looking forward to the conversation. In my history in construction, I've been in construction for a little over 15 years, and while I've worked in various capacities within the industry, my passion's really always been driven by building technology. So really excited to get into some of these topics today. Outside of my career at McKinstry, I'm proud to be a part of the Pacific Northwest chapter of the Avixa Women's Council, which is a group of women that come from various parts of the technical industry to come together to promote education, innovation, and networking within the industry. Thanks again for having me. I'll pass it back to Josh.
All right, great. Thank you, Lauren, and welcome. And last but not least, Chris Regula.
Hello, everyone. I'm the IT manager for ATS Automation. I work alongside Josh Kales. I've got a cumulative 20 plus years in the IT industry. I've been through various hats over those years, ranging from IT administrator to programmer to analyst, and now my current role is an IT manager. My current role focuses heavily on a lot of the topics that we're going to discuss today, and thank you for having me.
So thanks, Chris, for joining. We did make a last-minute switch because we had another person that had a personal issue, so thank you for stepping in last minute, Chris. You know, starting off this session, wanted to really think about network infrastructure and who are the key stakeholders in that as we think about smart buildings and sustainability and all these big goals that we've got. So what does that look like? So I think first question goes to you, Saloni, with a little bit of the end user as part of what you do. Who are the key stakeholders for smart buildings?
Absolutely. For us, we have 5 key stakeholders of equal importance. There are tenants, our operators, our capital partners, human health and well-being, and the environment. So for us, that's really where our focus is regarding stakeholders.
And have you seen, one or any of these kind of take the lead recently, or are they kind of all attention that are pulling at different times, or a pretty equal partnership in smart buildings?
I would actually say an equal partnership. I think what we're all learning in the age that we're living is so much is so, it's sort of like Venn diagrams. We all influence each other. And so I would say it's an equal emphasis at this point.
I think that makes sense. I know as climate change, sustainability continues to grow, it's taking a stronger influence, but I think it actually comes through all of those stakeholders in some ways. Kind of staying along with this, but still keeping on a question for you, but what are owners and developers wanting to see in network design to support their needs, enhance occupant experience, and address sustainability?
Sure. So I'm going to answer this at in two levels. I'm going to begin with the 30,000 foot level, and then we'll talk about the pragmatics. At the 30,000 foot, for us, what's really important is flexibility, reliability, and future-proofed. Our responsibility is also about creating assets that are still relevant without massive retrofitting about 10, 20, 30 years down the road, or with minimal retrofitting. What that translates to at a ground level for us is really in 5 pragmatic categories. One, the first is an efficient backbone and pathways. Currently, every system that we have has its own backbone. They don't talk to each other. It's redundant, it's costly, and they have different backup systems. The second thing that's important is bandwidth. We all need serious processing power. The third is owner-based cloud accounts versus physical or local servers in a building. They get outdated super quickly, like within a couple of years, and or several different vendor-based subscription accounts. So our focus is we really want owner-based, a singular account where we can have our data. The fourth portion of this is really picking the right software for data analytics, for eventually leading into machine learning. This is important in order to get coherent data, but most importantly, actionable data. And the fifth category being security.
And definitely a growing one. On the security one we'll dig into a little bit later. Kind of a similar question of what has taken priority precedence. How do you manage all of these needs and maybe some of the challenges behind that? What have we seen from, I know bandwidth and network design and things like that, getting into it has been a challenge because, like I said at the beginning, it's kind of been an afterthought in some ways. Are you starting to see that come in more from the end user perspective?
Oh yeah, I can. By the way, there is a very positive side to all of this, folks. So I don't want to seem like, hey, here are all the challenges, but it's true. I would say for us, what we have learned from all our past projects is there are 3 groups of challenges, and that's really the best way for us to be succinct about them. The first area of challenge is open communication protocol. This is super critical when it comes to data flow. We have so many things that we're monitoring, checking. SDCI wants us to do post-occupancy verifications, being conservative with our energy usage. So open protocol is very critical to make sure we are avoiding vendor or software lock-in for operations. The second area that's been concerning and challenging has been reducing emergency maintenance. There's regular maintenance, and then something goes wrong and no one knows why. And suddenly we find we're locked out of our systems, and that's a big deal. The third area, which is a huge vulnerability for developers like us that develop and then own, and also just a responsibility to our tenants as well, is contracts and warranties. We find currently that no one knows, who's responsible for what warranty. There are lots of scope gaps between contractors, vendors, ID providers, and even what the tenant teams need. So I would say those are our three big groups of challenges and concerns.
And I know, Lauren, you've had experience because you've gotten to get involved, obviously, on practical buildings. So let's get your perspective on that as well.
Sure. And, as we think about taking this design and putting it into place into an actual building, we find that some of the biggest challenges come very early on in trying to align all of the stakeholders around some of the key objectives as these systems are designed and built into systems. There's a strong, I think, urge sometimes to jump to tech, as they say, meaning using technology to solve all of the problems versus really kind of understanding what those problems are and developing good workflows with the technology to help enable the operations of the building. So really early on, just identifying, where certain systems come together, how they integrate, how they're used and maintained, and Saloni, to your point, how they are troubleshot and how they are addressed, when things go wrong. Really early to address from a very proactive perspective.
I think getting the group alignment, conceptually you say, hey, we just need to get all the parties involved and get them to the table. I know from a controls perspective or, building automation controls perspective, a lot of times we're late to the table in this discussion because we're down in the food chain. How do we address that? And I'll leave that open for any of the panelists. What's worked well in getting all these groups to have the right input on network design?
For sure, I can jump in here. I think it's really important to try to avoid that shadow design whenever possible. Trying to pull in controls vendors, network design or network architects, AV vendors, network vendors into the conversation as early as possible, just to bring forth those lessons learned and try to incorporate those into the designs as they move forward.
Okay, and then
and I would say, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Is it okay for me to speak to this?
It is. Okay? I was going to put you on the spot.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Actually, I would say, this is a really important question. And the reason is because I do want to spend just a minute on focusing on this, because this is the part where it says, we just talked about our concerns and say, how do you sort of tie everything together, given how we already, we have certain ways we're used to functioning and the vulnerabilities of contracts. So I'm going to break this into two parts. One is my role, or the roles of any of the developers that are out there. And my role is number one, is a shift in behavior where you're not dictating and expecting, but what you're doing actually is you're setting criteria and then you're supporting your team and enabling them. And I would say that when it comes to a very pragmatic way to get this to work from a contract document and a warranty, there are four things that it's important that we do based on how we already function in our world of design and construction. So the number one thing I would say to this is hire your team early. And the pairing of the team is, say, our network architect was really McKinstry, and we paired them up with our IT consultant, who is KDH. So they are one group that we hired right away, during schematic design and before design development. The next group that really is important to hire right away to make this work is really your MEP and your commissioning agent, because your OPRs and everything tie into all the work that is ultimately going to, be figured out during commissioning. The second component of this was getting your specs and your drawings aligned. Again, coming back to, who's doing what and your warranties. So Division 1 becomes a very big deal for us. It's something that we learned, where you outline, hey, here are all our goals. It's wired score. Here's the integrated architecture. And then that references Division 26, 27, 28. And again, there, with the MEP consultant speaking very clearly to the RFPs that are written to vendors, just like yourselves, to say, you've got these controls, electrical has these controls, but it's all speaking to this converged network architecture and those drawings. So those are things that become super critical. The last piece that I do want to share is what Lauren is about to share with you, are those diagrams. There are about 2 or 3 graphics that we use because this is such an unusual thing. We haven't done this in the past in network architecture and integrated into the contracts. we use these 1 or 2 diagrams to then communicate up and down the food chain, right from capital partners. We show the same one to like Greg, our CEO, sees it, our design team sees it, our subcontractors, our installers see it. Everyone can see visually exactly what we're trying to accomplish. So that's the other part that we found was super successful in helping us achieve this.
So I think that's a good moment to go into this, Lauren, of looking at the kinds of systems that owners and engineers want us to support on their network and showing what that looks like. I do want to get back, Saloni, after we go through this, to what you were saying about having access to your data, making sure that as systems go down and get restored, you can get them back online. You shared a story when we were doing some of the prep sessions for this that I think is really relevant to people, but we'll come back to that. So let's go into this architecture side.
Sure. So as Saloni mentioned, I do have a few graphics here to share. So let me just pull these up real quick here. So we have the presentation.
We can see it.
Awesome. So just looking at a very high level, broad view of a building, several different shearing layers within a building. And, over the course of 50 years, the changes that happen within a building could very well cost up to 3 times more than the original building. So really, when we think about a smart ready shell and core design, understands these shearing layers, the different life cycles that these layers are on, and plans for refresh modification as efficiently as possible. So when we think about provisioning pathway for added cable, added devices, making sure our IT spaces have adequate headroom for growth, both in cooling capacity as well as power capacity. When we think about including, as Saloni said, a very high bandwidth network, we need a lot of bandwidth. We have a lot of data to process from these buildings. So just making sure that we're accounting for that. Again, as Saloni mentioned, just managing those licensing agreements carefully and just understanding what is included in those subscriptions and making sure that we're making careful selections throughout the design process. And then also, defining those technology requirements, again, in the contract documents and warranties to ensure that we're, establishing the right path forward.
And maybe just hitting on this quickly, the subscription agreements is a challenge, and you got avoid death by 1,000 subscriptions. And I know we face this even internally with our IT groups. So question maybe for all of you, how do you manage that? And this manage the license agreements carefully, but maybe some practical things. What can we do?
Sorry, Lauren, do you want to answer that, or Chris first before I speak?
Saloni, I would love to get your input on it.
Sure. I would say we listen and we educate. Part of it is, you'll be amazed at how many people come to us and say, hey, here's what we've got. And which is, by the way, a wonderful thing. A big part of what we're doing is we don't know. We all learn, driven by our curiosity and past mistakes. So a lot of times either people come to us or we seek folks out when we hear of, different software out there, different vendors providing it. And what we do is we look at everything equally, so no pressure, but then we always come back to our network architects, like to Rick and to Mike, and we say, hey, let's go back to our diagram. Let's figure out, okay, what is it that we're trying to pull out and who is actually going to help us achieve these goals? And that's how once we go through that, we use that as sort of the gospel to then say, okay, these were the best folks to use versus let's not use these to hit all the goals that we were looking for, whether it was energy efficiency, wired score, or looking at making sure that, our TPP monitoring post occupancy, or rather, post DCO. So that's the way we approach it. It's like an education process and then a seeding process.
Lauren, Chris, anything to add? You've been quiet, Chris, so we'll let you speak in on this one.
I apologize, my mute was on there. Other than to state that, from an IT perspective, and we've seen this obviously in this industry as well, the shift from perpetual licensing to subscriptions. And the general positive result of that is products are generally better maintained as the vendors have a revenue source to continue to update their code and their push out updates. So I know subscriptions is not a popular word, but it's definitely not going anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Agreed.
Lauren, I also like that you call out, hey, we want more data collection. We want to use our data. We want to put it to use. So there's some really practical things on, well, you've got to have physical space. You've got to have IT spaces. You've got to have places for switch gear and whatever it may be, or switches. And just to get the bandwidth. Anything you would want to enhance on that, or just what you've seen in building layout design?
Well, and I also feel like, flexible pathway out to even the device level is always very helpful. I mean, when we think about trying to pull data out of a building, we'll have to have a sensor network, out there and able to do that. And being able to access those sensors and being able to pull that data in an efficient way is certainly very important.
Yeah, definitely. I'll let you keep going on this the slides.
For sure. So as we dig a little bit deeper into the building, taking a look specifically at the network architecture, this graphic really represents the difference in physical infrastructure for a conventional network versus a converged system. The converged system has less cabling. It can be more easily managed by the operations team, even from a remote setting, if you have the right remote access to the network established. And that being said, physical integration is great. We still require a virtual segmentation to split that network into smaller pieces to maintain security and reliability, things like that.
And that virtual segmentation being critical, but a lot easier to build on a shared network. We'll get into the security aspects, but what did it take to be able to lay this out and get all the groups to share those networks? Lauren, another question. I'm pointing these at you since you're presenting on it.
So, and sorry, say that one more time.
So I can see you had kind of independent networks running on the current state. That's what we see in a lot of buildings, and then you've got this converged overall.
Absolutely.
And was it Salone from your side driving that to say, no, we're going to share these, we're going to segment them virtually, so we don't get, then that's one of the questions we got coming up is
sure.
Yeah, and I think Lauren's next slide, yep, right here.
Right here.
This is a great one for us actually, from a communication point of view. Sorry, Lauren, why don't you speak to it first, and I'll add to this.
Oh, no problem. It really just is an example of the virtual segmentation, how different building systems align into different VLANs and enable, safe, reliable access to guest Wi-Fi, HVAC control, security, or the various other systems by the various stakeholders that live and breathe within the building.
Yeah, this diagram actually, it's a very important graphic version of our design, the network design, and who's speaking to what, because this also covers, tenant interactions, and then what we need from operations as well, and also from a security point of view. So I actually use this graphic when I have to show it, like I said, when capital partners ask us or tenants ask us. I show this to our subcontractors. I even show it, to me, the people who are installing this as well. It's so important for them to see it, because the power of to say, a picture's worth 1,000 words is so true. And this is something that we designed with, that's why that pairing of McKinstry's, our network architects, along with KDH, our IT consultant. And KDH, helped this. So this was very integrated. That's why you've got to pair them together every single time. And what's important about KDH's role is they're not only here with us for design, but they're there during construction, and they're with us even during occupancy, all throughout. So their role and having them on early is just as important as hiring, your network architects.
That makes sense. Yeah, I like how this starts to separate it out, and you can see it virtually. And then it gets even more practical, I think, Lauren, on your next slide, as you take it just from this conceptual piece to.
So something that can be incorporated into a contract set of drawings, for sure.
Yeah, exactly.
And as these building systems start to converge with IT networks, I feel like this type of graphic is really helpful in aligning system engineers along with IT network engineers, just to make sure that they're speaking the same language, that both are provisioning for each other's needs, and we don't have any scope gaps as we move through the process.
Right.
And Laura, and if I may, the other thing that's really has been super helpful for us as we've learned and refined even these drawings is that we've got this equipment room location. And why that's important is if you think about when we started thinking about, okay, how are installers and our subcontractors going to know? So we actually figured out, because they need to know, okay, where am I running something to? Where is the head end equipment? Where is that network gear that it's all hooking into? And so when you lay the equipment room schedule out and saying, hey, here's where it's beginning, here's where it's going, here's where it's monitored, suddenly everyone can see it. And the success of it actually getting built then goes up exponentially.
That makes sense. And maybe go back a slide as we talk just for a second, Lauren. I saw people even early on trying to leverage a single network, but I would say in the buildings environment, we weren't great at network segmentation. And so we actually talk about this, some of the challenges that you guys have seen and how you've handled it of shared networks. And this graphic shows part of what we've done to handle it. And so maybe I'll send it to you first, Lauren, and then have Chris talk about it because we've had to deal with it on the automation side.
Sure. Like I said, just a greater IT involvement, I think early on in system design is super helpful, just to ensure that we're all on the same page, that we're all fully aligned, that we understand as we're designing these systems that have devices that sit on either owner or tenant IT networks, that we understand the parameters around security, around reliability, and just the general topology before we get too far down the line and have to try to solve for integration requests that may be a little bit more difficult at that time because we hadn't considered those scenarios at the forefront. And I think a good operating plan and understanding what that operating plan is, both from the owner perspective and tenant perspective, if we can, is always super helpful. Just planning for the end in mind, not only for the day-to-day operations, but in the event that something goes wrong, we have plan A, B, and C all the way down to Z to be able to address it. And get folks back up online quickly.
Oh, that's good. And as a leading into Chris talking about this, I personally experienced I visited a university that had a single network layout design, but very complex, multiple buildings. Everything was sitting on the network, including students' laptops. And, you had the HVAC access, lighting control, everything. And they were having tons of communication issues. They were having broadcast storms. They were having all these network issues that really made their control systems not work as a result. And so it was kind of coming and saying, oh, you really got to change the way you set it up and separate these out. But Chris, maybe talk about that a little bit. What are the challenges you've seen, and then how do we bring solutions to that?
Absolutely, yeah. So again, from a perspective of an integrator, some of the more common scenarios we've seen have to do with multiple vendors on site, making changes to the system without coordinating with one another or even to the owner or management. There was no defined single point of contact to coordinate those changes at any one of those levels. And those types of stepping over one another could resolve in IP address conflicts with devices going offline, or what we call a broadcast storm, where you have multiple broadcast management devices on a single segment when you should only have one. So those storms, basically repetitive recursive traffic would take down an entire segment of devices. And we've also had issues with network numbers and device instance numbers, which are unique, being duplicated and resulting in unexpected consequences as well, which took a lot longer to chase down the root cause, not knowing the original change that triggered it.
Well, and one of the interesting things about making things smarter means putting in more sensors, more devices. And so those number of devices actually increases, potential for conflicts increases. So it seems like having a great strategy up front becomes even more important on setting this up.
Absolutely, that's a great point, Josh. IP addressing would be a good example of that, where typically you can get 253 devices on a single subnet. Obviously, we're getting hundreds, thousands. It's just increasing rapidly. Not only do you have to track subnetting and very specific gateway and subnet information, the VLANs somewhat help with that because you're creating an isolation between those IP address ranges stepping over one another. So what can be done? One thing that comes to mind is a formal change management process, and some of this is stepping on what Lauren was saying, literally having a good operating plan, being able to identify the scope of the change, the full impact of it, the timing of when the change is going to happen, and then having a single point of contact to funnel those through for approval would drastically reduce those conflicts between vendors. Another thing that can be done is leveraging a building network management platform, which is effectively a product. Some examples would be like Optigo or Armis or Tempered Networks, who provides a simple interface for you to get a better understanding of your current network topology and visibility thereof, as well as managing those VLANs and doing things like filtering by MAC address, so on and so forth. And then last on my hit list here is migrating towards the BACnet Secure Connect protocol, BACnet SC, which is in its beginning phases. It's beginning to roll out to newer devices and a few platforms. It takes the traditional BACnet broadcast design and puts it into more of an IP standard approach. So it falls more in line with what IT departments are used to dealing with and troubleshooting. As a result, it simplifies your traffic and your network topology. And the new protocol is also a lot more resilient to network changes. As the aforementioned broadcast storms, simply dropping the wrong device on a segment can bring down an entire segment. The new protocol is designed to alleviate that.
Oh, that's great. Kind of hitting on a couple of those key points, the change management process and how you manage multiple vendors. Salone, any insight on what you guys have done? Because I think you've had success. You've also probably lived through it all. So thoughts?
Yeah, no, thank you for asking, because otherwise I would have raised my hand and said, oh, can I please share? Actually, I really want to talk about what Chris ended on, and he said something really important. One of the things that we had asked for was, we're coming into, talking about open protocol and the importance of flow of data, managing your vendors. So I want to just back up for a second, where when we talk about, all these numerable controls, one of the things that's important, again, coming back to the way the contracts and RFPs are written and how do you manage that, we actually had McKinstry and we had Holmes sit together, talk to each other before they wrote their RFPs out. And the reason why that becomes important, as well as talking to, having KDH and everyone at the table, is to figure out, okay, who's got what and what is it that these devices are trying to do? And also, to make sure that you've got this whole open protocol, because one of the things we asked for is we want our buildings are BACnet enabled. And this is something that I learned from McKinstry as well, because the way I would put it is to say, hey, I want to make sure, and when I say I truly mean we as at Urban Visions, is, hey, we want to have open communication protocols. This is something critical, but we also don't want to get stuck where if something goes wrong, no vendor takes responsibility, or no one, and in all honesty, without blaming anyone, no one even knows whose system was supposed to be doing what, or whose device was supposed to be monitoring what. So by making sure there was the BACnet enabled for flow of communication, but then having a very well documented RFP, very disciplined RFPs out to control vendors, was another very critical part that has helped get us organized. and everyone else organized to say, okay, who's doing what and how does this all jive?
It's a really important point. I think as we look for ways to make life better as we're designing these smart buildings, getting the right people to the table early, and then the more defined an RFP can come down to a company like us on the controls aspect, the more we can help guide it, know what the expectations are in enabling a lot of these really technologies and communications.
By the way, a question just popped up, which is an exact question I asked. I asked McKinstry and everyone else, which was like, hey, what happens with technology moving? I think these devices can go can get outdated. I think that was the question from someone named Phoebe. That was exactly the question we asked. Like, hey, we're investing in all of this. And what they have told us and what we're learning is that replacing those devices is actually getting less and less expensive, or replacing parts and pieces of those is getting less and less expensive, and it's not a big maintenance issue as well. So the bang for the buck is a lot, it's a benign impact as opposed to a major impact.
Yeah, no, two really good questions. As you mentioned, I'm just going to read them off. Lauren, I'd like to get your thoughts on this too. Are ongoing and future innovations likely to make installations outdated for maintenance, repair, and partial upgrades? How long will manufacturers support their software and hardware? I can provide some insight as well, but I'll let you start with that one.
Sure. And, like I mentioned earlier, I think it really depends on the system you're looking at and the average life cycle of that system. I mean, AV, for instance, is typically on that 3 to 5 year life cycle, or perhaps even 5 to 7, depending on the system. So it's really, when you look at system design, thinking about the core system and what the roadmap looks like to upgrading and to expanding, and starting with a good core system. It's really kind of understanding the communication protocols and how they interact with other systems within the building to try to establish that independent data layer at which you can control multiple systems, but also pull data from those multiple systems into this independent data layer, and do a lot of your analytics and trending that help you make impactful decisions that affect the built environment.
Right. And I think to answer that question too, just from a manufacturer or software hardware manufacturer perspective, we're in a transition. And it's interesting because there's all these new technologies that are coming out. Some really cool technologies, I think things that are aimed at making our lives better. We've lived in a place where we had the same hardware for 20 years and it was fine, and now that's not the case. I mean, just supply chain issues alone we're seeing in the industry are driving changes faster. And I saw this with Allerton. Some of the controllers had the same chipset for 20 years. On the next round of controllers we developed, the manufacturers made them for about 2 years, and then they were on to the next one. This is the chip suppliers. This isn't me as the controller manufacturer. So, the speed of change has increased substantially. And as a buildings industry, we haven't done a great job keeping up. It's been interesting to, take people along the ride and the journey to upgrade firmwares and upgrade hardwares. And so I think that's a tension, and that's been a pushback to all manufacturers of make sure we've got as much longevity as we need, but also from an end user perspective, we've got to be planning for upgrades and updates. It's no longer a put it in once 30 years and you're done. Now, just even to keep along with cybersecurity and with optimization and analytics, AI, whatever it may be, we're going to have to be upgrading along the way. Any other thoughts on that?
And I would say, Josh, one thing, you just triggered a memory. We sat down with Mike and Rick, and they did a spreadsheet for us on all the end devices. And what we're doing is, and what all of us in the development world will have to start doing is, development takes about 3 to 4 years before it becomes reality, or by the time these devices need to come in. So technology has changed dramatically, even within a 2 to 3 year period. So we're taking a strategy of wait and watch. So we're saying, okay, what's the last possible moment that we actually have to select those devices? And we pick that last responsible moment. And we have this matrix or the spreadsheet of the different, the half a dozen suppliers, manufacturers, and that's what we're doing. We're waiting to see where it goes, get our backbones and get everything in, and then at the last responsible moment, pick whatever is the best out there at that time. But you're absolutely right, it's still a bit of a challenge.
Yeah, I think hopefully it just raises awareness of the mentality of, being quicker to upgrade and operate. Hopefully some of the costs of those things come down and we see that and we're able to make those changes quicker. The second part of the question was what national professional group is best handling the interdisciplinary aspect of this work, integration of vendors and systems. Also a work in progress, coming back to BACnet and just where it's going with Secure Connect. I like what I'm seeing there personally of kind of putting better standards and moving it more towards traditional IT standards and management. Chris Regula, you can comment on that versus, it was this open communications protocol that was proprietary towards HVAC, which is great when you're running separate HVAC mechanical systems, but now you're trying to speak to lighting systems, access control systems, whatever it is. And now managing those systems becomes more of a challenge. I don't know, anything to add to that, Chris?
Yeah, I think you nailed it on the head where, the IT departments are obviously a newer group to enter the building facility systems realm. By newer, I mean in the last decade or so. And we're starting to speak their language now. So it's not being lost in translation with some of the more obscure protocols that we're familiar with. So
just hitting on this, and I'm going to take this into our next question, which was really around cybersecurity. So there's this tension around open protocols and what that means, and then how do I minimize my attack vectors from a cybersecurity aspect? And so, what are the best practices to prevent cybersecurity breaches? Let's start with you on this, Lauren, and then I'm going to have Chris dive into the weeds a little deeper if I can.
For sure. When we think about cybersecurity and I think some of the things to keep in mind here, really, again, be very thoughtful in how systems communicate, how information comes across from building owner networks to tenant networks, who has access to that information, how do they access that information, and again, just be very thoughtful in that approach and be very deliberate. Don't necessarily open everything up to everyone, but don't close everything down such that you can only access it from one tiny machine in the basement of a building. So just trying to be thoughtful, just so facilities teams don't have to get creative, right? I think that opens up some vulnerability for operations teams when we have to create workarounds with, an open team viewer session or something like that to be able to access a certain interface for a certain system. I think profile management is also something to keep in mind, just careful approach to who has access to what, and if that's tied to a certain maybe Active Directory or something like that, that enables two-factor authentication. Physical security is also something to keep in mind here. Conduits and secured IT rooms and things like that keep cable pathways and equipment secure from just a physical perspective.
Good. Chris, I know you've got things to add to that.
Yeah, Lauren actually brought up something on my mind. So with the pandemic over the last year and a half, the cybersecurity profile and risks have increased dramatically. And a big driver of that is user behavior. Suddenly, the entire workforce was working from home, including facilities, and they needed access remotely into their systems. Even those sites that traditionally had no remote access suddenly had it overnight, and it was done in a quick and rushed fashion without much thought. So now I think many people are going back to the table and trying to establish remote connectivity in a safe, secure manner after the fact, realizing that that's just something they're going to need going forward. So that being said, some of the cornerstones of preventing cybersecurity breaches would start with zero trust network design, where effectively you, in a traditional fashion, everything would be trusted by default. Everything would have default usernames and passwords, open ports, open protocols. and then you would work your way backwards and start locking down your network. Whereas this approach is the exact opposite. You start by trusting nothing and then starting to make exceptions to that rule in a very careful and precise method. The next item would be leveraging BACnet Secure Connect as it becomes more prevalent, as it has encryption endpoint to endpoint. So that takes away one particular threat vector as far as just interfering with the protocol between devices. Utilizing VLANs, you're able to limit lateral network movement. So if a breach does occur, it's at least segmented off to a component of your network, and it doesn't open up all of your systems simultaneously. You can do damage control a little more effectively that way. And something we're seeing a lot more of, and we're just getting into ourselves, is network intrusion detection, prevention, and response systems. I know it's a mouthful, but effectively, these are sort of like an antivirus, but for network-based traffic, not for actual viruses on a computer. They come in a few flavors. There's a few different methodologies. One primary one is machine learning, where the system relies on what they refer to as a pattern of life. So the system will take kind of a baseline of how everything looks with traffic, with device communication, and then it will detect anomalies and it will attempt to give you the feedback without too many false positives. So you're not being buried by noise, and you're actually being helped to identify something that just doesn't look right. On top of that, the other types of systems are pattern recognition, where a company will literally record what type of activity a device normally has, and it assigns that pattern to that device. And if that device goes out of that spec, a flag is thrown. So those are two slightly different methodologies that both end up detecting something that's not right on your network. And in both cases, they rely on autonomous decision-making engines in the background, because when you think about a cybersecurity incident, it could happen within a matter of seconds, not minutes. Once an incident happens, it can escalate very quickly and move throughout your network. So in a way, you almost need a machine to fight a machine. And this autonomous decision-making allows the machine to respond and isolate by, say, turning off a particular device or an IP address, isolating it from the system immediately, and allowing a human being to come in and identify the problem and fix it in human time instead of machine time. That's what I have on my list.
I think that's good, Chris, because but what you're getting at on the cyber side is with a lot of the smart technologies, and there was a great session on AI earlier. One of the great things about the building automation side of it, control systems, is it's known traffic. There's polling rates that are going out and asking for data, pushing and pulling them depending on the system. So those can be learned, and you can understand the behavior, so it can help eliminate some of those cyber threats. So I think that's really relevant, how it ties back to, okay, hey, we want to collect as much data as we can. We want to put this data to use. We want to use open protocols, all the things that make that happen. How do we start locking it down? So I think those are some really practical uses. One of the questions that came in when we were talking about some of the protocol, standards and device communication and network setup even, was kind of a, hey, is there a time where maybe federal regulations or something will get ahead of manufacturers versus the manufacturers themselves setting the standards? And we certainly haven't seen that from a federal approach. We've got, I meant to mention ASHRAE and then the BACnet community, just from a building controls standpoint. There's certainly other regulatory entities that are driving to this. I do think that's an area of need still, where we pull it all together. And I think that's, really what this conference, a lot of it's about, is not just protecting your own turf, but really enabling, smarter buildings down the road, which means opening up our platforms to work together on some of this. I think there's a huge need in that area. And so it kind of leads us into one of our next questions on, balancing open communications protocol versus security. And so, Saloni, you mentioned it. I don't know if you've got anything else to add there. Otherwise, I'll let Chris talk through that for a second.
Yeah. Why don't you go ahead and let Chris do it, and then I can add a couple of things.
Josh, I'm going to actually step back for a half a second. I skipped over a couple of my notes on the prior discussion, the cybersecurity and how to prevent it. So if I can just finish that off real quick, and then I can dive into that.
Okay.
All right, so the ones I did forget relating to Active Directory, LDAP, multi-factor authentication for your network, using named user accounts instead of shared accounts for many of our systems, which has been a normal trend in the past. Trying to tying those to expiring logins as well. You know, with some of the more recent hacks we've seen in the news, that was an IT related hack, but it might as well have been something on the facility system side because it's all practically the same thing. That could have been avoided by that user account having expired. It was meant to expire, the employee had moved on. So that's something definitely to take away. And then when you do have shared credentials or any credentials of that type, storing them in an encrypted password management system, not in a clear text file or a spreadsheet sitting on a workstation, is a huge step forward in your risk avoidance. And then having training for cybersecurity for your end users, being able to test their abilities to detect a cybersecurity threat, assigning risk scores to individual employees or users, and then being able to target them with training to correct behaviors to avoid the breach to happen in the first place. And last thing I had here was patch management. So continuing to update, you know, firmware, drivers, Windows updates, what have you. That's obviously a huge challenge. There's zero-day exploits coming out daily. One thing you can do is partner with an integrator with a structured service offering. Like for ATS, we have one called Facility Shield, where the vendor will actually attempt to take over that the ownership, since IT kind of considers a lot of these facility systems to be out of their normal realm, not configured the way that they're used to. So a lot of their systems and procedures don't really align. So ATS or a vendor can step in and handle that and provide reporting and feedback as to how successful all of those updates are applied.
No, that's a great one. And just to emphasize what Chris was saying on, you know, simple things can lead to vulnerabilities, and the importance of patch management and just making sure your servers are up to date. And we'll get into on-prem versus cloud here in a minute. That's why I was kind of pushing us forward. But you've got to have people keeping these things up to date. And so that's one of the things we recognized as ATS was, hey, let's provide that service. And one of the big customers we got right away was actually a big IT company saying, we don't want to manage the facility updates and things like, we want you guys to do it, which kind of proved out, hey, there really is a need for this, because a lot of people have put their automation, our building control servers in a closet somewhere and nobody touches it. and in the age of connectivity, that's a bigger and bigger risk. Lauren, you talked about physical security and being a big part. That is a big part. And so anything to add to, you know, what do we do?
Well, you know, when we talk about physical security, I think, again, I mean, being thoughtful in the approach, beginning with the end in mind, as Saloni said, I think is super, super important. You know, not only locking them down to keep people out, but also allowing access for the people that need to maintain and operate, troubleshoot the systems in is also something that's important. Can't tell you how many service calls we've showed up to where we got to get in the IT closet and nobody has the key to it. There's no card access to it, and kind of keeps us from being able to help. So not only keeping people out, but also being able to get people in when they need to.
Maybe Saloni,
could I also speak to that?
Yeah.
Yeah, could I speak to physical security? Because we, like I said, we live with what we end up developing and building. This is something that we are super cognizant about, and I want to also acknowledge, we are along with our lessons learned on the physical aspect, we're also leveraging wired score. This is something that we discovered along the way. And what was interesting is it helped us recognize that what we were pushing for and what they were pushing for were very aligned, and it also helped us learn, get even better with what we wanted to do, both not on the network architecture side, but also on the physical security. Like for example, this project that you're seeing behind me, it's a big campus. And the number one thing that we were worried about is we just can't have one lifeline coming into this building. Someone cuts it, you've got 1,000,003 square feet, dead in the water. And so things like, redundant demarc rooms, making sure that where that point of entry, where you've got your main demarc, which is the brain of everything, right? You don't have a water closet sitting next to it where you can come in, and you'll be amazed at the mistakes that we've all, not necessarily us, that are made inadvertently. Things like, okay, when the conduits are leaving out of there, can someone just come in and hack through them? And, where are they going? So just being very, very cognizant of that physical, the travel cost, who is exposed to it, where are you routing it? When you're going up through the buildings, do you have redundancy there? If something gets stopped, cut off somewhere, can it go on to something else? So yes, it's very real and super important to track.
No, I appreciate you bringing that in. I think we've thought a lot about security from the network perspective, but there is a physical piece. And part of it is just by nature, the way these networks are set up, some of them being 2-wire, and you've got to protect that physically because there isn't, there's access that can be had through some of those systems if they're just available to people. So don't make them available to people, I think is the solution that you're getting at. I'm gonna actually, so we could take this 2 ways. We could take this into the redundancy piece and backups, but I kind of want to go first into the on-premise versus offsite for data hosting and what that means, and then we can go back into redundancy depending on how time allows. But I think that's a question, and maybe we'll start with Lauren on this because I want to get your perspective, and then let Chris chime in. But what are the pros and cons of hosting data on premise versus off?
Well, I think it really depends on what you want to do with that data, how you want to access it, and what that data either feeds or what you're hoping to get out of the data. Local computing allows us to really, analyze a lot of data in a very short amount of time. However, to have all of that on-prem computing equipment can be costly. Not only to purchase, but also the ongoing maintenance and operation of that equipment can be costly. However, when we talk about also death by 1,000 subscriptions and trying to safeguard against that, hosting too much data in the cloud can certainly lead to that. So I think it really goes back to, again, the end in mind, just kind of understanding where and how you want to access the data and taking a thoughtful approach on it.
That's good. Chris, talk about it from your perspective as well.
Absolutely, yeah. From an IT perspective, the things that come to mind immediately are compliance, security, of course, and scalability. One of the things that really appeals to me from a cloud perspective is that as your needs change, it can be a mouse click away to expand on your available virtual infrastructure for storage space or processing power or what have you. On-premise, of course, exactly the opposite. It's a capital expense. You have to go through procurement. You have lead times for equipment. You have spares and maintenance and all of the other things associated to it. So scalability is pretty high on the list for the cloud argument, why cloud would be preferred over on-premise. The other one is from a security perspective. The major cloud providers have dedicated enterprise security teams that are 24/7. That's hard for a company to reproduce on an on-premise network. They have IT staff that go home at the end of the day. And what happens at 3 o'clock in the morning when somebody's attempting to get into your system, I feel that they're better equipped to handle the onslaught, always-on approach. And let's see, on-premise, the IT departments typically neglect the system, as Josh mentioned. It can be sometimes in a basement, locked away, out of sight, out of mind, and it's not receiving the security updates nearly as quickly as it should, and it's become a threat vector. Those are the big talking points I had.
I think what Lauren was saying makes a lot of sense too. I think there's cases where keeping data in the cloud and even hosting the front end, if you will, on an automation control system in the cloud makes a lot of sense. There's certainly cases where it makes a lot of sense to have that computing power on premise. And so we're actually seeing more hybrid systems than one versus the other. Lauren, maybe comment on that.
Agreed. I think it's not necessarily an either or, it's some combination thereof. I think there's a careful balance, and it's very individual to each organization for sure.
One of the things I hear from customers when we're talking about, putting their building automation supervisor in the cloud and, hey, let's get it out of that closet. You're not operating it or you're not paying attention to it and updating it anyway. So we can help you from the cybersecurity aspect, keep it updated. Is, well, what happens if I lose connection to my building? And that's where having some on-premise computing power, which in some, building automation systems are built into global controllers, and it kind of depends on the system. The system continues to run and operate. It's not like the building shuts off if it's designed properly. You get the protection, you get the visibility of the cloud. But if there is a challenge or problem with the connectivity to the building continues to operate. And there's actually ways to go in and make changes if you need to make changes. When we think about redundancy with that, I know that there's cellular backup systems. Have you guys had any experience using that versus, just kind of traditional internet connectivity when you're looking at cloud hosted data? Question for Chris or Lauren.
And I'll let Chris take the lead on that one.
Yeah, so from an IT perspective, we like to have multiple internet circuits, multiple providers into a particular building for failover. If one ISP has a problem, the other one's most likely not going to have a problem. Most traditional network hardware can be configured to automatically fail over at the firewall or router level. And then on top of that, we would add a cellular failover. Cradlepoint is one of the main vendors in that market space. That obviously doesn't provide the same amount of bandwidth as your primary internet circuits, but it can be configured to prioritize certain traffic and provide a minimum level of service.
Going into redundancy and backups, big challenge, right? If systems go down and we see the crashes and we lose data, or maybe just the visibility of some of that data, what can we offer? And the question for Chris, and then over to you, Saloni.
Absolutely. So of course, the failover has, what are your priorities? What's your budget? How critical is the uptime? Those are going to decide what direction you go. We typically would define it as a cold spare, a warm spare, or a hot spare environment. And I'll just elaborate real quick on the three of those. Cold spare means that you have equipment standing by ready to take over in case, let's say, a server goes down, but there's manual intervention required. There's steps you have to follow to make it happen. That's typically the slowest response of the three, also the less expensive. Move into warm spare, where things are autonomous. The actual cutover is autonomous, but it's not instantaneous. There's a delay. You're waiting for systems to resynchronize. And then a hot spare, that's going to be your almost near instantaneous recovery or availability. You have multiple servers clustered together, and as one goes down, the other one just continues to operate. Those are our three primary scenarios that we configure.
I always appreciate this when I ask questions to IT. There's always a way. What do you want to spend? What do you want to do? Saloni, from your perspective, how have you guys addressed redundancy and backups?
I would say, linking back to your last question on this particular one, I would say, never underestimate the power of good common sense, and coupled with budget, as Chris said, and what is specifically, that your goals, or what you've got designed into your network and what you need your building to do. So when you take all of those, there is no one size fits all. What we tend to do is take a very pragmatic approach to say, okay, let's take a combination of perhaps some additional servers, some backup power, UPS. Then there's the emergency response service, with like a third-party network provider. So we again, I don't have a one-size-fits-all, but we do take a combination of these and then say, okay, then let's come up with a strategy per project for redundancies and backup. That's been our approach.
Okay. And I'm going to shift one more time to kind of cover one more topic before we kind of wrap it up, because we are getting close to end of time here. But this is kind of more on direct infrastructure questions on, do owners and developers or designers think IP, some of the technology trends we're seeing, IP networks and systems, power over Ethernet, and DC power devices will become commonplace in future buildings design? Kind of back to that question of, am I thinking forward enough? And then why? And so, Saloni, why don't you start on that one? We'll kind of go down the food chain on it if we can do it that way.
I'll be pretty short and succinct. I would say IP, yes, the more IP communication, the better. Regarding PoEs, I would say probably, but from what I've learned from McKinstry is that we need the cost of PoE switches to come down. And we need more what he calls, plenum rated switches to be available. He said the hard challenge that McKinstry said they've been facing is to figuring out how to plan for additional heat loads in IDF rooms. And the last part of this is the DC. A lot of the innovation is non-PoE power distribution from companies, but it feels like tech is still about a decade away. And so, this is Mike, and I'm quoting him, and he said, few standards or code requirements for this today, and but there's a risk of jumping into it too soon, just because it's still a decade away. So that's the feedback.
And this actually, your comment on standards relates to another question we got of, I think this is the audience asking, what can we do from a national standards perspective to promote this, get involved and to help drive some of these standards forwards. I know from my perspective, it is still participating in your industry, panels and things like this. These types of conferences actually help educate more people, and the education piece is a huge part of it, because it just raises awareness of design and design practices and where the technology could take us. Outside of that, any thoughts from you guys?
I think it also helps to take that. Oh, sorry, Saloni.
Sorry, I was just going to say, can I quote Mike? And I got to tell him he's been my best friend through a lot of this stuff. But one thing I do want to share that he shared with me, he said, following best practices from ISO, is it 27001, and the NIST standards, that was his feedback from a national perspective.
Lauren, go ahead.
And I was just going to mention that, taking this feedback and also taking it to lean back on manufacturers and push for those common communication protocols and common hardware specs, I feel like is always helpful. Just again, not necessarily to defend your own turf, but just to open up the industry to just allow for smarter choices around smart building innovation.
Well, that's good, Chris. And I know you were working through ISO 27001, and more from the security aspect of what do companies and businesses follow. But any other comments there?
Other than, it seems to be prevalent everywhere we look. Everyone's talking about ISO 27001. So that's going to be in all aspects of our lives. Good.
Well, I think kind of closing it in on this last one, really bringing it back around, definitely been good discussion. I like having, all the groups with the developer's perspective. So I'm going to end with you, Saloni, but what advice would you give to others that want to design and build smart building networks and supply a future-ready building?
Oh, okay. So I'll share this with you in two ways. One, the pragmatic, and I'm going to end on philosophy. On the pragmatic side, definitely 4 things. If you do nothing else, hire early your network teams and your IT consultants, MEP, and commissioning. Please do that. End of concept and early schematic design. Just get them on board. Get them all talking together very frequently. Get as much organized pathway. You know, in real estate, it's like location, location, location. And I'm going to say pathway, 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 and backbone. Because if you future-proof it, think of it like a neural network. If you get everything out there, you're not having to rip things out, you know, constantly to keep it relevant. And then high bandwidth, get as much processing power into your buildings. And the 4th is, I would say, succinct and frequent communication. Use those diagrams, create those cheat sheets, and leverage, you know, certifications like Wired Score. That's on the pragmatic side, is where I would say things to do. Philosophy, though, it does begin with the belief. We have to keep finding ways to tread lightly on our planet. And Josh, I'm going to quote you, you know, technology like architecture, you know, touches every aspect of our lives. It's about creating something beautiful and something responsible. A well thought out network architecture isn't just about shaping user experience today. Its actual true power lies in what it teaches us about ourselves, our behavior patterns, and our usage. You know, we live in a day today of data analytics, of digital twins and machine learning. And the knowledge that we gain about how we can design and build more efficiently for our future is super critical.
Love that summary, Saloni. I think it's so relevant with what we're dealing with today. I think the truth is we have to have the infrastructure in place to support what we're going to do, and we can do it in a way that does make people's lives better in a number of ways. And I know that's been pushed and discussed through a lot of the different panels in the Smart Buildings Conference. And so I think it's really important to end on that. You know, are there some capital costs involved in getting that infrastructure? Sometimes, some ways yes, some ways no, but really bringing the right people to the table early makes a big difference. I think that's what I heard from all of you. Any other closing comments, Lauren, from you?
No, thank you so much for the conversation today. This was great. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for participating, and same question to you, Chris.
Well, first off, Saloni, I almost used the word future-proof a few times in my conversation, and I held back from it, so thank you for using it. Don't get to use it often. Nope, no other comments besides that. Thank you for having me.
Well, great discussion, guys. Hope it was relevant for those of you that were listening in, and appreciate a lot of the thank yous that we got from those online. And with that, I think we turn it back over to the Smart Building Conference. Or maybe it stays online for another 2 minutes and ends exactly right on the time. I wasn't sure how that worked.
No, thank you, Josh, and thank you everyone for participating in the session and for attending. We really appreciate it. And this concludes our event. So we will be following up with a survey and the link to our YouTube channel where all of the session recordings will be available shortly. So thank you all again, and we hope to be engaged with you again in the future.
Thank you.
Thank you.